Creo que vamos a comenzar. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your attendance to this opening lecture of the Master Program of Global Politics and Transpacific Studies. On behalf of the Department of Pacific Studies and of the Master Program, I welcome you to this opening discussion and opening session that is especially organized for the students of the Master's Program, but also for the students of the International Relations Program of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities of the University of Guadalajara. Well, we are honored because today Ambassador Jorge Guajardo is joining us as guest speaker. We thank you for your willingness to deliver your lecture and to participate and collaborate with our master program. And then the dynamics of this session will be as follows. I'm going to give a short introduction of the Ambassador Jorge Guajardo, and then he's going to deliver his lecture. And after that, we are going to open a Q&A session, which will be the more important part of this opening lecture, because dialogue and discussion is the more important for in academics, actually, but especially for the topic we're going to address today. It's a very relevant topic. It's a hot issue, actually, in international relations, and I think an issue in which Mexico can take advantage, but we'll see what our guest speaker tell us. Well, if I may, I'm going to introduce Ambassador Jorge Guajardo. He is currently the director of the McCarthy Associates, which is a think tank or something like that, Ambassador, if I am right. Well, he served under 2 Mexican presidents as his country's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2013. During his tenure as ambassador, he met with President Xi Jinping and Vice President Wang Qishan and many of the Politburo members in China. He accompanied Vice President Xi to Mexico in his first trip abroad as designated successor. Ambassador Guajardo has visited every Chinese province and established close relations with provincial authorities, as well as with the key figures in the Chinese business and financial sectors. Ambassador Guajardo holds a bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University and a master in public policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Now the floor is yours, Ambassador, but also I want to tell everyone, to tell the students that you can make your questions since the moment the speaker start to talk. You can make questions on the chat, but also you can raise your hand, the blue hand in the Zoom, and we can give you the floor when the QA session starts. Well, now, thank you very much again, Ambassador Jorge Guajardo, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you to the Universidad de Guadalajara faculty for inviting me to this opportunity. It's a great opportunity for me to talk about China with a Mexican audience. As Miguel mentioned, I spent 6 years in China as Mexico's ambassador. That was from 2007, which was technically described as a coming out of China. You'll remember it was 1 year before the Beijing Olympics, which were in 2008. And I left in 2013 when President Xi Jinping had already assumed power, and there was a new phase to China. Immediately after leaving China, I came to Washington, D.C., which is where I'm addressing you from today. I've been here for 7 years working at McCarthy Associates, which is not a think tank. We're a consulting firm that we basically help corporations deal with foreign governments. Most of my work entails staying in touch and dealing with China, which has become more complicated lately. So let me tell you a little bit about what I see as has happened to the China-US relationship and where Mexico fits in that whole process. So we all know, or we have heard, or if you haven't, I will quickly tell you the whole China-US relationship began or started flourishing, or the modern part of it, with Henry Kissinger's trip to China to start a dialogue with them that was followed quickly thereafter by then President Nixon's trip to China in 1973, which was back then a groundbreaking event because, of course, they were supposed to be communist adversaries during the Cold War. They were not supposed to be talking to each other, yet it took an anti-communist like Nixon to be able to sell to the American public that an approachment to China was worth it as a new strategic ally against the Soviet Union. So in 1973, the United States opened a delegation in China. Chinese did the same. And then in 1979, with President Jimmy Carter, they established formal diplomatic relations. Before, they just had sort of like an observer status. In 1979, they established diplomatic relations. And thereafter began a process that was termed engagement. And the whole idea in the United States was that as long as you engage China, you can sort of coax it into behaving in ways that were favorable to the United States. And people say to the Western world, but it was more particularly a US strategy, a US-led strategy. And from 1979 to, I would say, the early or up to 2008, every president in the United States sort of assumed that reasoning, that it was, in any case, better to be closer to China than to be distant. And then in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. Its economy exploded, and I mean exploded by it started growing at a very quick rate. It started becoming a very big market. Just in the time I was there, from 2007 to 2013, I arrived in China when it was the number 5th largest economy in the world, and I left when it was the 2nd largest economy. So that was how fast it was growing. And business were taking advantage of what that meant, whether it was at first to manufacture in China. It was a manufacturing hub with good logistics, cheap labor force, and once it had entered the World Trade Organization, preferable tariffs as it exported to the rest of the world. So it became first a manufacturing hub, and thereafter it became a market in and of itself. The whole policy or theory of engagement started sort of changing in 2008. And the big cataclysmic event, or the thing that changed the whole way the US and China started talking to each other, was the 2008 financial crisis. Before 2008, China always assumed that they were the underdeveloped country, that they were the underdogs, that they were the ones who were learning from the United States and the rest of the world and the rest of the Western world. After 2008, when the United States experienced the financial meltdown of the 2008 crisis, and China did not, China sort of came out unscathed. They sort of assumed that they had reached the point where they had nothing else to learn from the United States. So they started assuming a more assertive stance. I say it colloquially that they became arrogant. In fact, they became arrogant, and I'll give you an example what I mean by that. So when I arrived in China in 2007, as most ambassadors do there, they're usually local media, which is all, of course, controlled by the government, by the party, asked you for interviews, just to get your perspective of whatever your country means to China, what China means to your country, so on. I mean, pretty benign interviews. And every single interview would end in the same way, which was, what can China learn from Mexico? Which, of course, as a Mexican, and I assume you will relate to this, we get in a very humble position and say, well, I'm not here to teach anything to the Chinese, there's nothing for each other to learn from each other. We're just here, to try to exchange. It was a very humble response, but they always ask, what can China learn from Mexico? After 2008, after the financial crisis, when they came out, when their economy kept growing while the rest of the world stalled, that question at the end of every interview changed to, what can Mexico learn from China? So they sort of started assuming the role that they were ready to teach the world their ways. It was a capitalism with Chinese characteristics that we were all supposed to learn and follow. And that started applying to many other areas. So I'll give you examples. It was around this time when they decided that they had nothing to learn from the rest of the world, that they started banning a lot of the companies that are now household names, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Uber, you name it. I mean, all these companies that are post 2008 or post at least in the way that they became huge, started being banned in China. And China sort of started developing its own ecosystem for their internet or their own development. And that was okay for the rest of the world or for the United States, in as long as their other companies kept profiting from the Chinese market. So you had the financial sector in the United States that were traditional allies of the Chinese Communist Party when it came to sort of advocating on their behalf in the United States. Well, all the financial sectors, the bankers, lost clout in Washington after the 2008 financial crisis. So whereas before they used to be the masters, they become the ones nobody wanted to be seen with. So the financial sector that used to be the big advocate for Chinese interests in China, all of a sudden wasn't being listened to in Washington. So China started losing its traditional allies in Washington, and there was no in-between, sort of no constituency advocating on behalf of a good relationship, or at least a continued relationship. Followed that by the fact that the 2008 financial crisis brought a lot of unemployment in the United States at a time when China was sort of inundating the country with exports to the United States. So a process of deindustrialization was accelerating in the United States. There's a direct correlation between the districts with the highest level of imports from China in the United States and the highest level of unemployment. That was a study done by author Hanson and I forget the third author, which was titled The China Shock. So it was a China shock. The United States experienced all of a sudden an overwhelming presence of Chinese imports in its country when they were hurting economically at a time when China started blocking their exports into China. As I mentioned, all these companies that were sort of making a name for themselves, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Googles, the household names, the ones that make the Americans so proud, were being blocked in the United States. I'm sorry, were being blocked in China. So that sort of started changing the feeling in the United States that engaging with China was going both ways, that both were benefiting, and sort of a feeling started taking place that it was only China that was benefiting, that they were taking what they wanted, exporting everything to the United States, but not admitting imports or foreign presence in their country. So as you started seeing that change in perception in the United States, in comes Xi Jinping as president in 2013. November 2012. Xi Jinping being a much more nationalistic president than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. So he comes with this idea of a China dream, that he's gonna make China proud, that he's gonna reclaim China's place in the world, that he's not gonna take anyone else's advice, and he's gonna just put China in the center. And that ruffled a lot of feathers because it was done in a way, if you will, not unsimilar to what we see from President Donald Trump's America First policy. Imagine the way the world, or we in Mexico, see Trump and his America First policy. And that's the same way that the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, started seeing President Xi Jinping's China. So he started by taking claims in the South China Sea, claiming territory that did not belong to China, that a United Nations court found did not belong to China. But just because their size, he figured he could get away with it, so he started getting territory. He started sort of using its market to punish other countries. So when the Japanese try to stake claim to islands that belong to them, he shut exports of rare earths to Japan and shut imports of Japanese products to China. So he started revealing sort of another face of what China meant, what a growing, more powerful China meant to the world. And it was not necessarily a phase that other countries wanted to entertain, particularly not in the United States. In the United States in particular, there was, again, a rising populism, a growing unemployment, or not, if not unemployment, a decrease in the labor wages, or a stagnation in wages. All these huge trade surplus on behalf of that favored China. So in comes Donald Trump. He senses this this feeling or this unrest, and he starts targeting, just as he did with Mexico, saying that he was going to undo NAFTA. He targets China as well and starts saying that he's going to block imports from China. With the difference that Mexico sort of played ball, and we said, okay, we will try to reach an agreement so that we're not blocked, and China didn't. China was in its arrogant phase. They were in this idea that nothing could stop them. So when Trump came and sort of threatened tariffs, they did not budge. They did not try to stop him. And the tariffs started picking up. And as the tariffs started picking up, China, or President Xi Jinping, because when we talk about China, it's important to differentiate between China and China's tradition and Xi Jinping, just as it is important to point out the difference between the United States and the United States traditions and Donald Trump. Just as we see Donald Trump, if you will, as an aberration of the tradition of the United States as it engages the rest of the world, the same applies to Xi Jinping. He's kind of an aberration, but a very authoritarian, nationalistic aberration that, by the way, has managed to change the constitution so that he can stay in power for as long as he wants. So he's sort of starting to be more assertive with its neighbors, with other countries, and that sort of starts ruffling feathers in Washington, and people start questioning, is it worth it? Is it worth engaging China? Is that something that that we are benefiting as much as we've been told since the trip that President Nixon did that was to the benefit of the United States? And the fact of the matter is that while this debate is going on, as I mentioned before, China loses its traditional advocates in Washington, which was the business sector. First and foremost, the financial sector, the bankers, start losing influence in Washington after the financial crisis. And the new names in business, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Sundar Pichai, all these names that we hear of the new economy in the United States, well, they're not invested in China. They have no interest. They're blocked in China. So there's nobody really advocating on behalf of a good relationship anymore between the United States. And from there, everything sort of starts falling apart. And by everything sort of starts falling apart, the United States sort of adopts under President Trump a whole of government approach against China. And what do I mean by whole of government? Every single ministry within the administration has a mandate to see what they can do to stop China. So whether it be the Ministry of Education or the Secretary of Education, they will see that China has no inroads into American universities. If it's the Justice Department, they'll target spying Justice targets spying. Then you see Treasury starts targeting currency manipulation, and so on and so forth. And you start seeing a whole of government approach targeting China at the same time that there is no communication between both countries. And by no communication, there were many dialogues, the strategic and economic dialogue, the strategic political dialogue. There were many dialogues between the United States and China, which, having participated in the ones between China and Mexico, I can tell you are very tedious, and very little is accomplished, but at least you're talking to each other. And whether something is accomplished or not, it's important to at least be gauging how the counterpart is addressing issues. Well, all these dialogues start disappearing in the United States. President Trump, who has little patience himself for paying attention, says, what's the point? Let's just cancel everything. And they start canceling every dialogue, and things start escalating. And whereas the United States before used to seek China's cooperation in climate change, well, in comes President Trump and quits the Paris Agreement and says, I don't need China for that. Or the United States would seek China's cooperation in containing North Korea, and in comes President Trump and says, I'll talk to Kim Jong-un myself. It sort of starts putting China in a difficult situation at the same time that China is blocking foreign companies from accessing its markets the way they access markets in foreign companies. I mean, the way Chinese access markets in the United States. So all of that starts clamping down. Tariffs that we now know start going into place. It was, according to President Trump, their way to bring China to the table. And even though the United States does have more artillery in terms of tariffs, just for the simple fact that they import more than they export, the fact is that when China stopped importing products from the United States, mostly agricultural products, it also put the United States in a difficult political situation because those agricultural states were from states that voted for President Trump. So he starts sensing discomfort among his voter base in the Iowas, the North Dakotas of the United States. So he further resents China for playing politics in the United States. And from there on, it has just been a free fall, whether it continuing with the closing of the consulate in Houston, the Chinese consulate in Houston, or the US consulate in Chengdu, expelling each other's diplomats, expelling each other's journalists. Most everything has been contentious now while nobody is talking. Stuck in this whole new scenario is business. And by business, I mean, first, the companies that started manufacturing in China and those that exported to China. And to make things worse comes the coronavirus, which, as we know, emanated from China, sort of pitted the United States against China because they were being blamed for spreading this virus. But on the other hand, China manages to control it. And as of today, China's economy is growing at 3%, whereas the US's economy is shrinking at 8%. So at a time when the only growing market is the Chinese market, the US is trying to pull away and leaving its companies or making its companies miss its only growing market while forcing them or trying to force them to relocate their manufacturing through the tariffs. Now, that's where supposedly the opportunity comes for Mexico. Supposedly there will be, and it's, I'll tell you why I use the word supposedly, and it is just supposedly. Supposedly there's going to be a reorganization of supply chains, excuse me. There's going to be a reorganization of supply chains in which manufacturers around the world are gonna realize that it doesn't make sense to be manufacturing in China if you're exporting to the United States because of the tariffs, because COVID interruptions, or whatever else may be the case, that it's better to nearshore, to bring your production close to home. And that makes perfect sense on paper until you realize that most of those manufacturers that started manufacturing in China to export to the United States or the rest of the world are now there to address the local domestic market, the Chinese market, which, as I mentioned, is now the second largest economy and the fastest growing market in the world. So all these companies are now more focused in targeting the Chinese market than in just manufacturing to export to the United States or Mexico. So whereas we think about the possibility that we're going to attract all this manufacturing back to Mexico because of the tariffs, fact of the matter is that not many companies are interested in leaving China. In fact, there was a poll released today in which only 5% of polled American companies that are manufacturing in China expressed any interest to move outside of China because of the tariffs. Now, out of those 5%, which is a tiny amount, we are still competing with Southeast Asia, the Vietnams, Indonesia, Malaysia, and ideally they may come to Mexico, but Mexico faces its own problems that are keeping companies away. Logistics, lack of rule of law, security. So even though technically we're supposed to profit from this break in relations, or what they call in Washington, decoupling, Decoupling is a word that's being thrown around in Washington often. I tell you, I read about it on a daily basis. I have yet to fully understand how you decouple something that's so entrenched with each other, but still there's an effort to try to fully separate China from the United States. And supposedly if that were to be successful, then Mexico would attract a lot of manufacturing to feed the US market that currently is taking place in China. I don't see that being the case soon. I don't think it'll happen, to be honest. But that's sort of the idea. And in fact, there's a book written recently called by Bob Davis and Ling Ling Wei of the Superpower Showdown that sort of portrays the whole US-China trade war. And in it, Bob Lighthizer, the United States trade representative, and Peter Navarro, who is in charge of China, both admit openly that their idea was to renegotiate NAFTA so that they could take China head on and sort of bring all that manufacturing to Mexico. They just never stopped and think that those manufacturers were not in China just to manufacture and export anymore, that they were there for the domestic market. So even though there are some areas that may be an opportunity for Mexico, particularly medical equipment. So we've seen in COVID how all these N95s, PPE was all manufactured in China, and that is problematic for the United States. That may be a trend, but it's just around the margins of things that may be relocating or where supply chains may be changing. That might be an opportunity. Geopolitically, the vaccine will be another big opportunity, the COVID vaccine. So the whole world is, of course, waiting a vaccine. We are talking through a computer because we can't go outside. And whoever comes up with a vaccine will certainly have a geopolitical advantage. We read that in Mexico that we are waiting for the AstraZeneca and Oxford University vaccine. But we also see that we are in the trial phase of the CanSino, which is a Chinese vaccine. So if China manages to develop a vaccine faster than the Western world, and out of the vaccines that are currently in phase 3 stage trials now, China has a majority of vaccines. And not only do they have a majority, but their portfolio of vaccines, the way the technology they're using for a vaccine, and remember there are several different technologies, is a more robust portfolio. I mean, they have more types of vaccines in development that if one doesn't work, the other one might, whereas the United States has a more fragile portfolio because if one doesn't work, the other ones, most of them are using the same technology, so most likely won't work either. So if China manages to come up with a vaccine, that may be a big game changer in geopolitics. If China shares a vaccine with the rest of the world, if they share it with Mexico, it would certainly create a lot of goodwill in Mexico. Those are the things that we should be paying attention to in the future. For now, I'm a skeptic in terms of what the opportunities are for Mexico in this trade fight. I haven't seen anything concrete, but what I have seen concretely is that there's really not much opportunity, and I'm sure that's going to be a big question, or there are going to be several questions in the question and answer session, whether there's an opportunity for Mexico to export to China. And let me just tell you that in 6 years that I was there, I found none. We are not complementary economies. We're both manufacturing countries. We manufacture for export. What we do, they do cheaper. So I never found much of an opportunity for Mexico's exports in manufacturing to China. Yet there's always a temptation in Mexico to sort of look for opportunities of opening the Chinese market. My guess, it's a waste of time. We don't export technology. That's the only, I mean, when you export technology, whether it be Qualcomm microchips or Boeing jets, the Chinese market has an opportunity for you. When you export just manufactured goods, not your own intellectual property, there's not much opportunity. And that's the case for Mexico. So again, and we do well being with the USMCA. We're in a good position, but we're in a good position regardless of what happens between the US and China. So that would be where I would leave it for now. And if I may open it to questions and start a dialogue.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your very interesting presentation, for sharing your perspective about this very important relationship between the two great world powers. Well, now I don't see questions written in the chat. If everyone wants to participate, just raise your hand in Zoom and we'll give you the floors. Actually, if one of the professors, of course, wants to participate, just let me know. And there are questions here, and also as I am speaking, I would like to advance one question, regardless of the questions that are going to come out. Ambassador, in your opinion, you started with a historical revision of the China-US relationship. To what extent do you think these current China-US strains are caused by Donald Trump? Is mainly a Donald Trump approach, or to what extent this is a trend of the relationship itself?
That's a very good question. And in fact, President Trump has sort of claimed authorship of all of this sort of front against China. That's not the case. So you see Senator Chuck Schumer, who's the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, had been a strong anti-China advocate in the US Senate. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has been very critical of China for a long time. So no, there is bipartisan consensus. There are very few things on which Washington agrees. China is one of them, and that is that there's got to be pushback against China, that the era of engagement is over, and that there will be a new set of rules going forward. Now, China doesn't seem to understand this, and China keeps blaming the United States. And every single day you see statements from China saying it's all the US's fault. And I think it's very important, and I'd like to reemphasize what I said during the conversation. So yes, I mean, we're Mexicans. I personally hate President Trump. I think he's the worst that could happen to the United States or any other country in the world, or the fact that he happened to the world. I mean, you won't find a bigger critic of Trump than myself. Having said that, never underestimate the responsibility Xi Jinping bears for this. And he is just as bad, if not worse, as Trump in the way he engages the US or other countries. So that's why there is consensus in the United States that this is untenable.
Okay, no, I think we all agree about Donald Trump. Well, there are some questions in the chat. Here, Andrea Martinez asked, what would Mexico need to start negotiations with China? And I think she means for a trade deal with China.
For a free trade agreement, I would assume. So we don't need nothing other than to recognize. The only requirement China asks of other countries is that they recognize them as a market economy, which Mexico already does. Now, having said that, I don't think there's any constituency in Mexico for a free trade agreement with China. So every single year, China says it's gonna open its markets to Mexican imports. Every single year, the trade deficit between Mexico and China grows. We import about 20 times more than we export to them. They are extremely protectionist. They're protectionist with countries with whom they have free trade agreements. They're protectionist with countries within the WTO. My advice would be not to enter into a free trade agreement with China. We have nothing to gain. We have a lot to lose. They want to import raw materials. Mexico has tried hard to move into the manufactured sector. So I don't think you'll find much of a constituency in favor of a free trade agreement with China.
Thank you very much. Well, there's another question from Jorge Millán. He asked, what about the opportunities of Mexican agricultural products in China?
So yes, there certainly is an opportunity there, but I'll remind you that China is a very protectionist country. So for instance, when I was there, we tried to establish the import-export protocol on pork meat. And we did that on the very first year I was there. And I'll tell you a sort of a short story. And it was my first year as ambassador. I didn't know much. Well, you know, I was 12 years later, I can do the Videgaray mistake of saying I was learning in the process, but that's a fact. I was learning. And in comes a producer of pork meat from the state of Sinaloa and meets with me at the embassy and says, you know, Ambassador, this is fascinating because China consumes in one day what Mexico produces in 1 year of pork meat. Now you listen to that and all sorts of ideas start going through your head. So you immediately say, that's brilliant. You know, that's how we're gonna compensate for the trade deficit. So let's immediately start opening the market. So we start a process of an import-export protocol of pork meat. We started in 2007. We signed it in 2008. They didn't send agricultural inspectors. Remember, for this, in order to export your meat, you have to get their inspectors to come and sort of inspect your farms and deem them safe for export until about 2009. They started putting little, I believe we sent the first export in 2014, 7 years after we first started negotiations. Even after doing so, they started, you know, putting or raising issues in why we shouldn't be exporting all the meat. And it was only later that I learned that Mexico imports pork meat, that we don't produce enough to satisfy the Mexican market, let alone to export. So that's a type of temptations, and then reality sets in about the opportunities. And I'll give you another one. So we tried exporting avocados. That was signed during the Fox administration. China doesn't need avocados, so I think as of this day, we export more to Singapore than to China. We tried exporting limon persa, and Chinese said that yes, of course, they would be glad to buy our lemons, but in exchange, we had to open our markets to Chinese apples. Well, I didn't know that, but it turns out that China produces or grows 1 of every 2 apples in the world. So the minute you open the Mexican market to Chinese apples, you pretty much run out of business every Mexican apple grower. So every single time we started an opportunity, we realized that we would lose more than we would gain. And that's, again, because the Chinese market can be a combination of protectionism and just competing against a behemoth.
Actually, I forgot to tell the attendees that you can also make your questions in Spanish. English is the official language of the master program, but here I think that we should take advantage from the experience of the guest speaker, and I would like the students to enter into direct dialogue with Ambassador Jorge Guajardo. So if someone wants to participate, just let us know. There are more questions on the chat. Armando, he asked, what is the actual leverage power of China's exports of rare earths?
That's a very good question. And so rare earths are, despite the name, they're not rare. They're called rare earths because they're very polluting. The refining of these earths is highly polluting, so no country wants to do it. In essence, and China sort of has a monopoly. They produce 97% of these rare earths, which are used for everything in between cell phone batteries to ballistic missiles. It's an important material that no country wants to find itself without. What China has, when they say they have a monopoly on rare earths, what they have is a monopoly on willingness to pollute refining rare earths. And they used it in, as I mentioned, I believe it was around 2009 with Japan after the spat they had with the Senkaku Islands, which out of the blue, China started putting export limits on rare earths to Japan. And that's where the world sort of became aware that this was a problem, that China had a monopoly that they could exercise. There is, as of this day, there's an initiative in the US Senate precisely for the United States to start producing its own rare earths. whether in the United States or in other parts of the world. China has some leverage with it. I think they overplayed their hand. Most important right now. So let me just give you a quick something to watch for. There's a big issue between the United States companies not being allowed to export semiconductor chips to China. Now, the United States produces all the semiconductor chips that China needs to develop, the Huawei's, the CTE, all this. And there's the Trump administration has shut down all exports of these, which pretty much brings China to its knees. Without US semiconductors or the machinery to produce semiconductors, which is all US made, there's no way they can develop a technology industry. On the other hand, there have been voices in China advocating for China putting a similar export ban on medical. So turns out that they're the only ones who are producing certain antibiotics, certain medicines, and they're saying, you know, we should put the same ban of exports, sort of bring the other countries to its knees. They're hard to implement, those type of export controls, but again, that's the type of pressure that countries are going to start exercising, or at least China is going to start exercising more going forward.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Well, here's another question from Grecia Robles. She was my student, I remember her. It's a long question, so I would ask Grecia if she wants to make the questions lively. In Spanish, it can be. Grecia, are you there? Would you like to jump in the discussion to make your long question? Where is she? Verda. I think we need to activate her mic.
It says she can't talk. So Miguel, let me just tell your the audience one thing.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi, Grecia. Adelante.
No, I was just asking, like this whole Trump strategic to like stop all the all the work in China to be transferred like closer to the United States. That is just a strategy to help him in the elections of 2020, or is that like whole speech is going to backfire, you know?
That's a good question, Grecia. So it started as an interesting proposition. The whole pushback on Chinese manufacturing was a good idea that was well received in Washington. As with everything with Trump, it very quickly became political, in which he started using it for political gain, not for strategic US gains, but for political gain of himself. And then, as many other things with Trump, he sort of lost sight of where he was going. So to this day, nobody understands now what the aim is anymore. He talks about decoupling. Nobody understands what he means by that. He tweeted about 5 months ago that he was hereby, or no more, like about a year ago, he was hereby ordering every US company to leave China and move to the United States. Not a single company did so. So what started as a strategic approach quickly turned into political, and then just became as a Trump mess, in which it's more about his ego now than anything else.
Well, you were about to say something to the audience, Ambassador.
And I apologize. So my light is giving me trouble. So I'm sorry if I'm darkening in the screen here. So if there's something that you can all take away from this talk, and we can continue talking, but if there's one thing, if the one takeaway I would recommend you take with you is follow closely the issue of semiconductor exports into China, the ban on microchips from the US to China. That in and of itself can be cause for war between both countries. Why? Because it turns out that there's this Taiwanese company, and you'll remember that China considers Taiwan part of its territory. Taiwan does not consider itself part of China's territory, and the US has a big influence over Taiwan. Well, there's this one Taiwanese company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor and Microchip Corporation. And they produce most of the microchips used in China. And they have just recently been prohibited by the US because they use US machinery and US software. they've been prohibited from selling its microchips to China. Turns out that microchips are one product in which you can actually establish monopolies that are hard to overcome. That is to say, you can't build up microchips just by throwing money at it. You can't build up microchip facilities in China the way you could say, for instance, if you want to build an atomic bomb or a nuclear bomb, it doesn't matter if it's the best or the worst as long as it explodes. If you want to put a man on the moon, it doesn't matter if you do it most efficiently or least efficiently as long as he or she can land the moon and return. With semiconductors, it does matter if they're the best or not. And the fact of the matter is that the best are produced outside of China, particularly by this company, TSMC, which has now been forbidden from selling into China. And that can just overnight disappear most of the Chinese tech companies, Huawei, its whole move into 5G, and all of these, if you can imagine, it's the US telling a Taiwanese company that the Chinese consider their own, that they can't sell to China. So that is gonna really raise tensions between both countries. It's gonna create a lot of problems. So pay close attention to where this leads. This is the one issue that I most focusing, and if you may, obsessing over.
There are two more questions on the chat, but before, Professor Miguel Ijar wanted to make a question. Are you there, Miguel? I think we need to activate maybe his mic. Are you there, Miguel?
Thank you, Miguel. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jorge, for your very insightful talk. My question is about Huawei exactly. How do you think that this war between the United States and China, in terms of these of the dominance or the predominance of one of these countries in the development of 5G technologies will play out? How these developments that you just mentioned will affect each other's capacity to gain the upper hand in terms of the 5G race?
That is the question. That is the question. And again, this is the one where I suggest people pay the most attention. Imagine Mexico is playing the World Cup against Brazil, and they sort of beat us every time. And we know, and we've come to expect that they beat us every time. And in this case, the US plays Mexico and China plays Brazil through Huawei. But all of a sudden, Mexico realizes that we have a monopoly on sneakers and on shoes, period. And that the Brazilians cannot come out and play with shoes unless we sell it to them and we decide we're no longer selling shoes to you. So now you're going to come play barefooted against us. That would certainly give us an advantage. It would sort of disqualify them. And that's exactly what the United States is doing to Huawei. So Huawei had a clear advantage over any other company in the world. And mind you, there were no American companies competing on 5G. It was just Nokia and Siemens. Nokia and I forget the other one, out of Europe that were competing with Huawei. Huawei was poised to sort of develop the entire 5G infrastructure in the world, which would give them a huge advantage, not only because they are now responsible for this kit that will have to be maintained going forward and updated, etc., gives them geopolitical presence, but there are big suspicions that it also gives them an edge in intelligence gathering, that if they are managed to, so the United States is trying to fight them, it's trying to convince other countries not to buy into Huawei, it's not convincing that many. It goes to Canada, Canada says, doesn't sound too convincing. It goes to Germany, Germany's like, no, I don't believe you. It goes to UK, said maybe. It goes to New Zealand and Australia, convinces them. New Zealand and Australia say, okay, fine, I'll buy, we'll ban Huawei. And China just starts this offensive against them because they banned Huawei. So all these other European countries are saying, no, let's not pick sides between the US and China when it comes to Huawei. And then all of a sudden somebody comes up in the United States and says, tell you what, Huawei can't do anything unless we sell them microchips. So let's stop the sale of microchips. And overnight they're put on this thing that the United States that nobody ever knew existed, called the entities list. I mean, when I say nobody knew existed, it was used against Iran and its Revolutionary Guard. It was not used cases with China. They're put on the entities list. All of a sudden, you cannot sell Qualcomm, Intel, NVIDIA, all these microchip manufacturers cannot sell their product to China. And turns out China does not have that domestic capacity and cannot build it. And that's a big misconception out there. And you'll see a lot of people saying, well, by doing so, the US is just pushing China into developing its microchip industry. That is not true. They cannot. There is such a lag that even if China spent enormous amount of money, the type of microchips they'd be able to manufacture at this point are the 10 nanometers, which compare with the 3 that are being developed, nanometers that are being developed in Korea, Taiwan, and the United States, are just not competitive in the market. And they don't have enough of a market to justify their own industry within China. So it was all of a sudden a checkmate against their whole technology that they have not figured out what to make of it. But as of this day, they have enough reserves to keep them going for a year or 2 of production with, they stockpiled microchips from the United States, sort of fearing that this might happen. But after that, they're gonna run out of it and they're gonna try to develop all these 5G systems around the world. And turns out they don't have the hardware for that. They don't have the microchip and they can't deliver. So any country now deciding whether to buy Huawei kit, which is the way it's called, has to make a decision. Okay, it might be more affordable, but will it be usable to use from now? If we need to upgrade, will they be able to do it? If it breaks down, will they be able to replace it? And the answer is most likely not. So it's sort of a checkmate. China has not figured out how to respond to this. They're sort of hoping against hope that a potential Biden administration will change. Nothing has indicated that they would. And if they don't, all of a sudden, China faces a real problem with its whole technological industry.
Well, there is one last question, Ambassador, and we are running out of time, and this will be the last. Jose Antonio Llamas wants to participate. Jose Antonio, please go ahead.
Hi, Ambassador. I have a question regarding the infrastructure and connectivity investment projects that China used to have in the past administration with Mexico. There was a reapproachment with this currently administration. Actually, the first ambassador to visit President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was Chinese, and the second was Russian. But in this sense, there was an agreement, a future interest in participating in the development of the Istmo of Tehuantepec, and also in the in another infrastructure investment project. But actually, nowadays, for the Istmo de Tehuantepec project, there are no major participation from the Chinese investors. So in this sense, how can Mexico take an advantage and try to seek for investment of China in this point that actually the United States left a huge void in Mexico and in other countries regarding connectivity and infrastructure? Or if conditions change with the visit of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, because right after the visiting of the president, suddenly Garcia Luna was detained. I don't know if
that was before that he was detained. But I think I get the gist of your question. And if I may, so I'll start with a disclaimer. I'm not a supporter of President López Obrador. I'm in fact a critic. I'm a member of a political opposition party, so I'll just want to make that clear. I am not, in this case, being completely objective. I am a critic of his administration. Having said that, let me just remind you, the first visit President López Obrador received was from Mike Pompeo, the then Secretary of State. That was the first international visit he received. The second was the Chinese ambassador. Here's what I noticed from that visit. Yes, it was a second visit, but whereas every day President López Obrador would come out, and you remember in the steps of the La Casa de Transición, the transition house, he would give a press conference and sort of say, this is what we had discussed. Whoever was his visitor, he would come out and sort of inform what the visit was about. When the Chinese ambassador visited, he did not do that. It was Marcelo Ebrard who came out at the steps, and he very quickly said, we told the ambassador that we were gonna focus on the trade deficit with China, that our whole relationship with China was gonna focus on try to balance our trade relationship. And if I may, I really like that. I really like that. I thought it was smart. I think it's been smart of this administration to not follow the dream of the Chinese potential the way other administrations, including ones I've been part of, have done and fallen. It's been wasted time and wasted opportunity. And I thought it was smart for President López Obrador and smart for Marcelo Ebrard to very quickly say, no, we're gonna just focus on the commercial aspect. Having said that, what opportunities do we get out of China? Well, clearly the Chinese have developed an edge and a knowledge and an understanding on infrastructure development. Trains, tunnels, harbors, they do them more than anyone else in the world. They have an understanding. They usually cater to countries that do not have access to financial markets. Mexico does have access to financial markets. We don't need Chinese financing, but they may have Chinese knowledge. In that sense, they can tender, they can participate in tenders like any other country around the world. They can compete with ICA, they can compete with Siemens, they can compete with anyone who participates. And if they produce or they offer a good product at a good price, we should take advantage of it. That's it. That's the extent to which we should try to take advantage of it.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I don't know if you want to finalize this session with a closing thought before we finish this opening lecture.
I want to thank you, and thanks all the participants. I see there's 147 now, and thank you all for bearing with me. I am not at my best when I'm speaking English. I'm sure you're not either, but we're trying, and I think it's a good thing that Mexico is trying to start speaking English more. So I commend the Universidad de Guadalajara for this effort. Thank you for inviting me. Be realistic about what China represents for Mexico. My guess is it's more of a threat than an opportunity. I always try to emphasize that. It's easy to assume that the Chinese represent an opportunity for Mexico. Every turn they've been more of a threat or more of a challenge. So let's be realistic about that. I tweet often on the subject. If this is something you wanna be interested in, you can find me at Jorge-Guajardo at Twitter, and that's an issue I tweet a lot about. And thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Yes, follow him on Twitter. He posts very interesting things about China, US politics. And well, on behalf of the Department of Pacific Studies and of the Master Program on Global Politics and Transpacific Studies, we thank you for being here and for giving us this opening lecture. Very illustrative, very insightful, very interesting. Thank you very much, and we hope this is not the last time we dialogue with you. We discuss this kind of issues with you and topics.
Hopefully in person next time. I would love that.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for your attendance. See you soon, I hope, in class. Hope. So, bye-bye.